Hello and welcome to the Modern Maker Workroom. In this episode, we are going to be working on lining the skirts. Every step in here is all about lining the skirts, so get your needles ready and let's start stitching. We'll begin by giving the linings a nice press before we even separate them. We've cut them out, they've been sitting quietly waiting for us to work with them. So first we give them a nice steam press and then we'll separate them into right and left halves. The way I'll do this is the way I always do, and this makes sure that I do not get confused and accidentally make two left sets or two right sets. You see that I've got one open and I then place the second half right there so I can see very clearly that I have a right and left half. And I'll just throw a pin in to make sure I don't lose that alignment. Once I've got that done, then I'll be ready to begin stitching. Now this is done with a single strand of T60 thread, so this would be top stitching weight thread. And I'm just going to use a small running stitch and a 3/8 inch seam allowance to put this together. Note that the seam allowances on your pieces may be different. Every so often I'll take a small back stitch to make sure that the running stitch stays secure. When I reach the end, I'll take a couple of stitches in one place and then cut the thread. The process is repeated with the second side. I'll take my running stitch, and you just saw that I took an extra back stitch to make sure that it stays secure. These seams won't be under any stress, so a running stitch is a convenient stitch that's very fast and easy to execute for us to sew these pieces together. You may use a back stitch if you wish, if you feel that these seams will be under stress during wear. Once the side seams are sewn, you'll also close the center back. You'll have one large piece of skirt lining ready to press. After we stitch all of the seams, we'll press each one in succession, and this just locks the thread in place, gives it a good firm crease, and makes the seam look a little better. Now that I've got those pressed, I'm going to press the seam allowances open, and I'll do this for each of these three seams. After the seam is pressed, I use this block called a clapper to press the seam allowance open. You've seen me use this before, but every time I put it in my hands, I want to make sure I've told you what it's called and what it's for. The wood cools the seam allowance very quickly after being pressed and keeps it locked in place and makes the crease permanent. My apologies for this slightly washed out white. The sunlight coming through the window was brighter this day than it had been before, and I was not prepared for it. But this shouldn't affect us being able to see what's happening. So the lining is ready to go into the skirts, and you can see that I've pressed the hem of the skirt up and I'm ready to get it sewn in place. Where I'll begin, however, is at the waist. I start at center back, and you can see that I'm basting the seam allowance of the lining to the seam allowance of the body. And where it crosses the side back seam, I'll just skip over since the side back seams were sewn vertically. But this secures the lining in place, and it gives me something to pull against as I begin working on the hem a little bit later on. Basting the seam allowances in like this is very important because it helps the garment stay stable. Many people will make the entire lining for the body and they won't secure it this way at the waist. And in the end, the result is that the lining itself will be quite slippery and may start rolling out the bottom. When we secure it at the waist, it helps keep it in place, it helps add to the longevity and stability of the garment itself. Now as I approach the front, I'll leave the front 2 to 2.5 inches unsewn, and that's because we need to work the center front edge at some point, and we want to leave the lining free for that. You'll notice the stitches are relatively large. They don't have to be super small and tight in this instance. You just need to be mindful of how you're easing the fabric in place. You want it to be even, and you want it to be in the correct locations. You don't want to misalign any of the seams. because if you do, it could complicate things when we start to hem the bottom of the skirting in place. I'm nearly done here, just crossing the side back seam allowance and working my way into center back. Once that's done, then we'll turn our attention to the rest of the hem. One of the more important steps that we have when putting a lining in a skirt like this, especially when so much of the skirt lining is on the bias, is that we want to really place the lining exactly where it needs to be. So you can see with my hands, I'm smoothing the lining right into the shape of the skirting, and I'm putting these large catch stitches just spanning the entire width of the skirt, tacking it both at top and at the bottom. And this, coupled with the ease, helps keep the lining exactly in the location where I need it. I am lining up the seams. I'm making sure that the entire lining is firmly in place before I even begin to turn the hem up and stitch it in place along the bottom. This makes sure that I am not going to pull tightly on the lining and distort the shape of the skirt. I've worked my way past the center back seam, I'm crossing the other side back seam, and now I'm about to work my way across the other front. Once this is done, then I will be ready to turn the hem up at the bottom and sew this lining in place. It's time for us to start the actual basting of the outer edge in place, and you can see that I've pressed in the center front edges as well. Now these seam allowances at center front are slightly larger than the seam allowances that are allowed in the rest of the garment, and that is because the center fronts will carry a bone on each side. Now I am simply using quick basting stitches to hold the lining in place. I'm turning the lining under as I go, and the reason that I do this is so that I can make sure that everything is perfectly aligned. I feel sometimes that if I press this up beforehand, I might end up with the wrong length of the lining. So I always want to do everything in its proper place, and this way I can be certain that the lining is doing exactly what I need it to. You'll notice as I'm turning the corner, I fold this corner under and then I fold it under again, and that just keeps the majority of the bulk out of the immediate corner of the garment. The layers of wool and linen of the exterior are already quite thick at the corner, and I want to avoid making them too much thicker. So as I work, I'm taking these stitches a little bit away from the edge. You can see when my hand creates shadow. Again, I'm sorry for the washed out nature of the video. I tried to darken it as much as I could. What I'm doing is just taking very long stitches, maybe an inch per stitch, just holding it in place as I would with pins. But again, you don't want to use pins because if you do, your working thread can get caught around them and stuck as you're trying to stitch the final hemming in place. So basting is a much wiser choice. You can see that as I'm easing the lining in around the back, I'm just very gently adding a slight bit of fullness into the hem here, and the ease is simply to prevent any pulling of the lining on the exterior layers, as I mentioned earlier. Notice how carefully I'm putting it in place. I'm trying to leave about 1/4 of an inch, I think it's about 6.2 millimeters, 7 millimeters, something like that, of exposed wool. And it just keeps the lining set far enough back from the edge that there's no tendency for it to roll out. Okay, the basting is complete, and now it's time to begin the actual stitching. In this shot, I'm using a felling stitch to work my way around the edge. I am capturing the edge of the linen in each stitch and inserting into the wool and exiting through the linen. If you need to see the felling stitch, you can refer to the series of public videos on the YouTube page for the Modern Maker. There's a great close-up shot of how to work a felling stitch. As I reach the corner, I make sure to aim my stitches so that I have one stitch that goes exactly through the corner, and then I'll turn the work and I'll keep stitching. Now, I don't need to make these particularly close together. These stitches are probably about 3/16 of an inch apart. Not quite a quarter of an inch, but close. They don't have to be micro tiny though. This is not a very stressed part of the garment, and these stitches don't need to be fine haute couture. They just need to be functional, and they need to be regular. I think consistency will make them more attractive than if they're just done small. The consistency is what adds to the beauty of the work. With the skirt lining stitched in place, now we just give the entire edge a really nice strong press. Now, the hem already has a hem stiffener placed in it. It's been turned up. The lining is in place. So we've got a nice, very meaty, structured hem on this little jacket. And I think when it's sitting over a hip roll on top of a skirt, it's going to look very, very attractive. This gives this nice, sturdy, rustic look to this jacket, which is exactly what we want. Now, of course, since our stitching is complete, we can simply remove all of our basting. We don't need it anymore. Everything is exactly where it needs to be. You'll notice that I left a small top portion at both center fronts unstitched. If you see right there, it's about 1.5 inches. And again, that's just so that I have room to work in as I'm putting bones in place later. If you've already stitched this closed, don't worry, it shouldn't be a huge crisis. I just wanted to leave, I like leaving myself room to work in case other things have to happen. So you can see that now I'm removing the basting that held the hem in place. And as that comes out, then you can see this beautiful wool with its nice crisp hem. And I think it's just going to look great. Thank you so much for following us here. Please visit themodernmaker.co or our Patreon and sign up to subscribe. Thank you very much, and happy stitching.